For long, Niger was one of the West's most important allies in the Sahel. After last week's coup, it joins a growing number of countries in the region facing an uncertain future. A delegation from the West African regional bloc ECOWAS has arrived in Niger now for talks with the new military leadership. ECOWAS said it's prepared to intervene and restore the democratic government to power by force if necessary. The delegation is in Niger in a bid to find a diplomatic solution and head off military intervention. I'll be speaking to an expert to find out what Niger's future could look like. But first, this report on the evacuation of foreigners from a country that could be falling further into instability.
As uncertainty hangs over Niger's future, hundreds of foreign nationals are heading home. Evacuation flights have been carrying citizens mostly from European nations. Loved ones reuniting back in Rome and Paris after a hasty exit.
At one point, we really felt that sense of insecurity. We knew that everything could change at any moment. All of a sudden, the situation felt unsafe.
Foreign officers have been coordinating to get as many people out as possible. More flights are scheduled for the coming days, with embassies keeping a close eye on developments.
We are always in favor of a diplomatic solution. That is why our embassy remains open, and we will see what happens. Of course, we are for the restoration of democracy, and we will see how the situation develops.
As foreign nationals flee, the situation they're leaving behind looks increasingly precarious. Nigeria, which supplies 70% of Niger's electricity, has cut its power supply to put pressure on coup leaders. Niamey has calmed after protests supporting the junta turned violent on Sunday, but the mood is still tense. The junta shows no sign of backing down, despite ultimatums from the ECOWAS bloc of West African nations to reinstate ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. It warned it could use military force as a last resort.
The recent coup d'etat in the Republic of Niger is one event that calls for our collective attention and a united response. We must face the challenges of restoring democratic governance in Niger head-on, drawing on our shared experiences, wisdom, and collective resolve.
But other neighbour states are backing the coup. The governments of Burkina Faso and Mali have warned that any intervention will be seen as an act of war. The clock is ticking down to find a resolution, with ECOWAS giving the junta until the end of the week to restore Niger's democracy.
Mavemba Pezo Dizolele is a director and senior fellow at the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Good to see you. ECOWAS has sent a delegation to negotiate with Niger's military leaders. What chances of success does this initiative have?
I think it will all depend on the tone of the negotiation, Nicole. I think the sabo-rattling that we saw early on about the threat of intervening militarily was pretty counterproductive. When military officers decide to stage a coup, that means they've accounted for all the ramifications that may come to them. It's like crossing the Rubicon. So threatening with force, I don't think that's an encouraging way. But now that the delegation is on the ground, hopefully they will have serious diplomatic talks that will lead to some resolution to this. I have no idea what the form of that resolution will be, but it's definitely encouraging that they're talking.
And ECOWAS saying that they wouldn't shy away from military intervention as a last resort, you say is saber-rattling. Do you think they wouldn't live up to their words?
It is very challenging to mount any type of military operation, especially if you're trying to get the military to release and then restore President Bazoum as the president of the country. So mounting an operation actually increases the risk even to the life of President Bazoum. And then in the end, this is in many ways an internal problem. There is a risk of making matters worse. We also know that a lot of the leaders in ECOWAS are not particularly democratic themselves. So the issues of legitimacy and credibility from where the message is coming from.
Niger now completes what is being called a coup belt that runs thousands of miles from Guinea in the west to Sudan in the east. How much of a destabilizing factor could that become for the region?
Niger is not going to be the destabilizing factor. Niger, as you just mentioned, Nicole, is the last of the countries to get a coup. We started with Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and so on. So we cannot blame the trends of coups on Niger. The problem is there are many drivers of instability in the region. That instability had started with the invasion of Libya. We need to face those facts as well. And there are issues of bad governance in all those countries. Those coups are similar, but they're not the same. They have common drivers, common sources of instability that lead to coup. But in order for us to address them, for the international community, for the world, for the partners of Niger, of Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on, we need to face the reality that the West has invested heavily on the kinetic military side of foreign policy, and they've not invested as much on the democracy and good governance. Yeah. So for the populations in any one of those countries and beyond, whether you have democracy or whether you have a military government, it doesn't make much difference because services are not delivered. People are still unemployed, eating is a problem, and so on. What is the difference? The difference will come when we start building strong, good governance, good policies, and so on.
Yeah. There has been speculation about Russian meddling in the coup or plans by Moscow to send Wagner mercenaries to support the junta. How much truth is there to that?
We've not seen any evidence of the Russians being behind the coup. We need to keep in mind that the bulk of the military officers, at least in the case of Niger, who stages coup, have all been trained either by France or by the United States. So until the coup, they were good friends of the West. They were not accused of being close to Russia or anything. Now that the situation is unfolding, I think we need to be careful, the West that is, in the way we engage them so that we do not create opportunity for Russia or the Wagner Group or anybody else to fill that void. We saw that didn't work well in Mali because the EU was very stringent in the way that they engaged with the Malian officers, and I think that was a loss. So we need to avoid such a loss when it comes to Niger.
We don't have much time, but maybe briefly, what is your long-term outlook for the region? Can we expect more unrest, or is there a chance for a diplomatic solution to this growing instability?
We should be able to expect that the West will engage more robustly than it did in Mali. I think this is a wake-up call, not just for the populations in Africa, but primarily for Western countries. What exactly is the end goal in the Sahel? The population of Sahel is young. They want change, they want freedom, they want democracy. The West should be able to provide that and scale up its engagement on the democratic and institutional side, and not just focus on the kinetic military side.
That was Movemba Pezzo-Dizolele. Thank you so much. He's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Nicole.
Annelise Bernard is the Director of Strategic Stabilization Advisors. That's a firm that provides guidance to organizations in conflict zones. And I asked her how likely a diplomatic solution to the crisis was at this point.
At this point, it's not fully clear how likely that will be successful. Obviously, we're all hoping it is, and that there's some grounds for the ECOWAS delegation to at least manage a restoration of constitutional order and hopefully some version of a transition towards democracy. That's the ultimate goal. But right now, it's not fully clear. I think we'll know in the coming days how successful that is. And we'll certainly see that with regards to actions taken by other neighboring countries with regards to closing the borders or other kinds of economic sanctions. Those will be huge indicators to see how well those conversations have gone.
Yeah, these sanctions, these measures that are being taken not only by ECOWAS, but also the World Bank now, for example, and they're putting a lot of pressure on the junta. And I'm wondering, how long can they keep the country up and running under these circumstances?
Right. Well, and that's an important thing to discuss, right? Because I know these numbers might be a little bit outdated, but when I used to live in Niger in 2017 to 2019, the statistics were something like nearly half of Niger's GDP itself is driven by international aid. So obviously with not just sanctions from the World Bank, but other European partners, we're talking about a huge cut in any kind of assistance this country is getting for humanitarian assistance. A significant portion of the country relies exclusively on access to food aid from the international community, from WFP. So if any of that gets cut, which could happen, that will obviously certainly have impacts on daily life, making some of the most vulnerable people in the world, in one of the poorest countries in the world, even that much more vulnerable. Yeah. Broadly speaking, though, I should caveat and say that even if the U.S. does cut security assistance, which is most likely going to happen at this point, that does not include cutting humanitarian and development aid for the U.S. government. And the U.S. does provide most of the funding to WFP. So at least with regards to that, I think that we're a little bit okay. But anytime you have a group of vulnerable people who are losing access to basic resources for their ability to live every day, you'll see them start resorting to more desperate measures. And given that there are multiple jihadist groups threatening multiple sides of that country, we can only imagine that particularly in the periphery on the border, you're going to see increased recruitment by jihadist groups.
Yeah, and Niger has been the West's key ally in the Sahel for a long time. What would be the consequences if the country really descended into instability with all of these actors that you just mentioned, maybe seizing this moment?
There's a lot of really scary situations that can play out. The one that I'm tracking the most right now, since I've been watching the expansion of jihadist groups in the Sahel into coastal West Africa over the past 2 years, is that Niger was the last remaining bulwark of stability where the West had a pretty strong grasp on being able to repel and contain some of these jihadist groups that were operating kind of freely in Mali and Burkina Faso. If Niger becomes an impermissible place and a less reliable partner for Western security partners to operate in, and also development partners who do provide a lot of that countering of the violent extremism, I think that we're going to see the potential for Niger to become an open pathway for jihadists to expand their access and mobility and then territorial expansion into coastal West Africa. So that directly threatens specifically Benin and Nigeria.
There's also a lot of speculation about a Russian influence through the Wagner mercenary group. What's your assessment of a threat in that form maybe facing the country?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk on social media right now that some of this might have been fomented by Wagner, or that Russian disinformation has kind of escalated things. I don't see any veracity to those claims at this point. Obviously, there's stuff that we just don't have access to in terms of intelligence reports that might suggest otherwise, but it's my understanding that Russia and or Wagner Group were not involved in this. That said, we have seen in Mali and Burkina Faso in particular, where they were involved in the actual coup itself and the instability, and the issues that led to the destabilization of those democracies, but they came in afterwards and exploited the narrative, particularly the anti-Western, anti-imperialism, and anti-French narratives that kind of emerged in lockstep with the coup military juntas at the same time. So I think that we can expect them to do the same in Niger.
That's Annelies Bernard. Many thanks. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And for more, I'm joined now by Thomas Silberhorn, a member of the German Parliament for the Conservative CSU party. Welcome to DW, Mr. Silberhorn. Thanks so much for your time today. Now, Germany hasn't set up its own evacuation operation from Niger. It's relying instead on other nations. Should the German government be doing more to help in this situation?
Foreign Office has already announced that German citizens can use the offer of France to evacuate civilians from Niger. And there are only a few people from Germany in Niger, so this is a sufficient offer. On the military side, our soldiers are still deployed in Niamey, and this military route is still open, so there is no acute danger for our soldiers so far.
OK. Now, aid workers, we know that some aid workers don't want to leave Niger. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, is there a concern that this situation will prevent Germany from supporting those people who need help in Niger?
There has always been preparedness of Germany to do much, much more for not only Niger, but the entire Sahel region. But now, after years, we see that military coups are really spreading across this region, not only in Niger, before already in Mali, in Chad, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso. It seems that there could be a mutual encouragement of military leaders to take over. But this region has been on a pathway for democracy already, on a way to improve its governance. And this way should be continued, in particular in Niamey and Niger. This has been a model of democracy in one of the poorest countries of the world. And that's why Niger has been so far an anchor of stability in this region, which is heavily under threat of terrorists and extremist groups.
German soldiers, as we've been talking about, have been helping to train troops in Niger. The German army operates an air base and it's building a military hospital there. You're clearly saying that Germany's support of the country should continue, but will that be possible? Will all of this change after a coup like this?
At this moment, the conditions are not met to continue our support for Niger. But what has been initiated so far was in a good faith on the pathway of democracy in Niger. And of course, we see that the entire Sahel region is under threat from terrorist and extremist groups, which means it's necessary to keep the secular state order. And of course, this is a huge challenge, in particular for the armed forces, because usually the armed forces of African countries have not the same task as we know it in Europe or the Western world. They are usually trained to secure the external borders and not for defense and deterrence against aggressors from outside. But the military forces are not educated, not trained, and not equipped for doing more than securing the external borders. They are in particular not trained and equipped to fight terrorists and extremists. And this is exactly what the support of the European Union and of Germany has been so far, to engage in the training of military forces so that they can take the new tasks of military in Niger, in Mali, in all these countries. But of course, strengthening the military forces in these countries always had a risk of military officers to take over on their own. That's what now has happened, and that's why we cannot continue our support as we did so far. We have to appeal to the coup plotters in Niger to come back to the route of democracy and to install again the democratic elected president. It was a role model that the president of Niger has been re-elected. And that's why this coup is so heavy /back.
Mr. Silberhorn, can I ask you, are you worried about an increase of Russian influence in Niger, given the situation?
Well, it might be that the paramilitary core of Wagner and Russia tend to make use of this situation. But we should stay at the facts. So far, Russia has not even a bilateral embassy in Niamey. There are no core contacts between Russia and Niger. On the contrary, the Western democracies, the European Union in particular, and in particular Germany, did a lot for supporting Niger. And yes, we have own interests in with respect to migrant routes, but our engagement has been much, much broader, addressing the real underlying causes of poorness and of the climate situation. So it was a broad approach of the entire Western community, and in particular of Germany, in their support for Niger and the entire Sahel region. And Russia is far away from offering any support to this region.
Thomas Silberhorn, a member of the German Parliament for the CSU party. Thank you so much for your time today and for speaking to us on DW.